Good morning, everyone. I'm here today with Premier Kenney and MLA Michaela Glasgo, who represents Brooks Medicine Hat. Earlier this year, I had the opportunity to meet with the Minister of Public Safety and the Minister of Justice to talk about firearms policy in Canada. My advice to them at that meeting was to consult broadly. Make sure you talk to law-abiding firearms owners, and make sure you really think through this policy that the federal government was pursuing. Instead, we got a hastily developed policy that simply has frustrated Albertans from corner to corner in our province. We've received so many people have reached out to our office to express their concern. And what we've heard from them is that they don't want policy developed in downtown Toronto. They want policies developed right here in Alberta to reflect their needs and what they want done in our province. We expressed as well to Ottawa our frustration that when it comes to gun crime, the vast majority of this is coming from illegal guns brought into our country from the United States. About 80% of the guns are brought in from the United States that are found in crimes. That's where the focus should be, targeting organized crime to make sure that people are safe in their communities. And we're also going to stand up to make sure we have an Alberta-made justice system. Earlier this week, the Premier announced that we're going to be establishing an Alberta parole board. That means we're going to have more Alberta and less Ottawa in our justice system. And with that, I'd like to introduce our Premier.
Thanks very much, Doug, and thanks as well to Michaela for joining us for an important announcement today about asserting Alberta and defending law-abiding Albertans against a federal attack against their rights as law-abiding firearms owners. Alberta has a long history of responsible firearms ownership. In fact, it goes back to our very beginning as a province. And be it hunting, sport shooting, or farmers and ranchers using guns for predator and pest control. While some people in faraway places like Toronto may not understand the reality, hundreds of thousands of Albertans are simply use firearms as part of everyday life. Those law-abiding Albertans should not be used as scapegoats for the actions of criminals by politicians in Ottawa. The opposition to the former Liberal long-arm registry was strongest here in Alberta of any part of Canada. Albertans rightfully understood that treating farmers and duck hunters like criminals would do nothing to deter criminals who by definition don't care about the consequences of breaking laws. Canada does have strong gun control measures that we support, including licensing and background checks. Licensed firearms owners are actually subject to an automatic criminal background check every single day. Restricted firearms are tightly regulated, including how they are stored, transported, and safely used. Ammunition capacity is limited. Handguns have been registered in Canada since the 1930s. Unfortunately, however, there are some politicians who prefer to go after easy targets, being law-abiding Canadians and their legally obtained property, instead of focusing on the drug gangs and criminal smugglers who willfully endanger lives every day. Such actions illustrate the huge gulf between the federal and provincial government's approaches to combating crime and to responsible firearms ownership. Put simply, while some in Ottawa believe in targeting legally purchased inanimate objects, Alberta believes in targeting actual criminals who represent a threat to public safety. That's why I'm very pleased to announce today two new actions by Alberta's government. First, we are creating an Alberta Firearms Advisory Committee to advise the provincial government on firearms policies under our provincial jurisdiction. The committee's 12 members will include 3 MLAs to be chaired by Michaela Glasgo of Brooks Medicine Hat and joined by Valley View's Todd Lowen and Onaway's Shane Getson, as well as retired law enforcement officers, hunters, sportsmen and sportswomen, collectors, and a former member of the Canadian Armed Forces. These women and men are exemplars of responsible gun ownership with broad knowledge and expertise. I'm confident that they'll provide the Minister of Justice with thoughtful, sensible ideas to help us craft policies for responsible Alberta firearms owners. The second action that we're announcing today is designed to strengthen Alberta's justice system's ability to prosecute real gun crimes. As our Crown prosecutors will tell you, the lack of a provincial testing facility for firearms weakens their ability to bring accused violent criminals to trial in a timely fashion. The Calgary Police Service already has a testing facility, and the Edmonton Police Service is in the process of establishing one. But all other police forces in Alberta currently rely on the RCMP's National Forensic Laboratory Services in central Canada to perform this basic procedure. And today they are waiting on an average of roughly 8 months for the results, and that of course includes the RCMP that provides police services throughout rural Alberta. This puts successful prosecutions at risk, that 8-month delay. And due to the Supreme Court of Canada's Jordan decision, long delays in the justice process can result in criminal prosecutions, including those involving gun crimes, from being dismissed outright and allowing criminals to go scot-free. So that's why I'm pleased to announce that the Government of Alberta is partnering with the Calgary Police Service, the Edmonton Police Service, the RCMP, and the Alberta Law Enforcement Response Teams to patriate all of the province's firearm testing to the lab in Calgary and the forthcoming Edmonton Police Service facility in Edmonton. This will speed up the testing process to ensure that no prosecution of a gun crime gets derailed because tests are being held up down in Ottawa. Both of these actions that we are announcing today are needed because of Ottawa's failure properly to balance the prosecution of criminals with the protection of the rights of law-abiding citizens. If Ottawa really wants to protect Canadians from gun crime, it should massively increase resources for the interdiction of firearms being smuggled across the U.S. border, and most of that is happening, again, in central Canada. And it should stop the revolving door justice system and slap on the wrist sentences for violent gangsters, mainly from drug gangs, who are behind most of the firearm-linked fatalities in Canada. We sincerely hope that the federal government comes to realize this. Now, as I mentioned a few days ago, we'll be appointing an Alberta Chief Firearms Officer to replace Ottawa's appointee, and there is a motion before the legislature on that subject, which will be further debated tonight. And we are studying the possibility of further actions based on the advice of the new committee that we're setting up today, and this could include supporting the likely legal challenges coming forward from Albertans and other Canadians to challenge aspects of Ottawa's recent regulatory overreach. These concrete steps are moving us towards a system of firearms administration in the province that is rooted in the values and the priorities of law-abiding Albertans. And with that, I'd like to invite MLA Glasgo to say a few words.
Thank you, Premier, and thank you, Minister. Good morning. I consider it to be an honor and a privilege to be asked to chair the Alberta Firearms Advisory Committee. Advocating on behalf of Albertans for private property rights has always been a priority for me, and that includes the right to lawfully owning firearms. Since being elected, I have stood up in the House on more than one occasion to speak about Alberta's proud history of responsible gun ownership. I grew up around firearms. I was always taught that safety came first and that guns were useful tools for life when employed in a safe fashion. When the federal government instituted its gun grab on Canadians, I have to say that I, as well as a large majority of my constituents, were appalled. Many Albertans have expressed a deep desire for more autonomy from Ottawa. I hear about it regularly. The passing of C-71 last year imposed unnecessary red tape, fees, and hurdles on law-abiding citizens and business owners. And the recent order in council from Justin Trudeau and his government will now force hardworking, responsible, law-abiding Albertans to hand over their private property, and Albertans are rightly frustrated. I am too. And to add insult to injury, Ottawa is also entertaining the idea of allowing municipalities to ban handguns. Municipalities are under the direct purview of the provinces, and frankly, Alberta has had enough of Ottawa's meddling. This is overreach to the nth degree. Albertans want less Ottawa, not more. These recent attacks on gun owners' rights will do absolutely nothing to address the core issues that lead to gun violence. Gang activity, illegal weapons smuggling, the drug trade, the list goes on. These are the issues that the federal government should be focused on, keeping everyone safe. We need firearms policies that recognize and support the ability of Albertans to own and possess firearms in a lawful and responsible manner. I truly am looking forward to engaging with all Albertans, including farmers, ranchers, hunters, and shooting sports enthusiasts, to ensure that this well-capable committee provides advice to the government that accurately reflects the values of responsible Albertans. Thank you.
Okay, we'll get the Q&A started. Operator, could you please put through the first caller?
First is Graham Thompson with iPolitics. Go ahead, Graham.
Yes, thank you for taking my call. I was just wondering, Premier, we haven't seen the Fair Deal panel's report yet, but based on the fact that you're looking at, of course, appointing your own chief firearms officer and also potentially the Alberta Parole Board, is this sort of a precursor to, are you leaning then towards an Alberta police force and an Alberta pension plan?
So, Graham, we will be releasing the Fair Deal panel report in a couple of weeks. We wanted time to digest it and discuss it, both as Cabinet and caucus. In fact, we were just doing that earlier today. I look forward to advancing the discussion about how Alberta can get a fair deal in Canada, not just a discussion, but concrete actions. As you know, one of the issues we asked the Fair Deal panel to look at is whether we should be creating an Alberta provincial police force. We had one in this province in the earliest decades of our history until the 30s, of course Ontario and Quebec have their own provincial police services. This is not really relevant to to most of our cities that have their own municipal police forces, but it is very relevant for rural Albertans who depend on the RCMP as their local police force through the contract we have with Ottawa. And Doug here can tell you, as can Michaela and so many of our MLAs, about the profound frustration that rural Albertans have felt coping with the rural crime wave in recent years, the unacceptable response times, and the perception that often management decisions are being taken in distant Ottawa for an urgent situation here on the ground, and there's a lack of understanding about the local reality sometimes in those RCMP management decisions, and so we think there is a real issue here. We've not made any final decisions, and I would just say stay tuned for the Fair Deal panel. I have asked Solicitor General Schweitzer to come forward with options in this regard for the government to consider. Of course, this could be an important part of asserting a stronger Alberta in the Canadian Federation. But again, no final decisions have been taken.
Operator, can you please put through the next caller?
Chris Varco with the Calgary Herald. Go ahead, Chris.
Hi, this is a question for the Premier. Premier, is the province considering a ban on commercial rent evictions as British Columbia has adopted and the Alberta Chambers of Commerce and the CFIB are calling for?
Yes, we are considering that, Chris. First of all, I think a commercial landlord would have to be darn near brain dead to evict a viable commercial tenant during this crisis, because there's just nobody stepping up to fill empty storefronts. I can't imagine how that makes any business sense to evict commercial tenants. I would strongly urge commercial landlords to give distressed commercial tenants a lifeline at this time to get their affairs back in order post-pandemic. It's, I think, in the interests of both landlords and tenants. Secondly, the federal provincial commercial tenant subsidy program, in which we've announced our participation at a cost of $67 million, is there to support landlords who themselves may be facing financial distress. And yet we are hearing more and more stories from small businesses about landlords who are refusing to participate in that. Their participation in it would reduce by 75% the commercial rent payable by tenants, with the balance being offset by the provincial and federal governments. So at the very least, we would ask those commercial landlords to participate in that program. And we are looking, if they refuse to do that, we are looking at options similar to the one adopted by British Columbia. I understand Saskatchewan and some other provinces are considering it as well. And so I would just say stay tuned for an announcement in the near future in that respect.
Operator, can you please put through the next caller?
Janet French with CBC. Go ahead, Janet.
Hi there. Thanks for taking my question. So, I mean, the federal ban that was just introduced was related to assault-style weapons, is the terminology they're using. I'm just hoping you can help me understand, and I'm not sure which of you is best versed in firearm use. How many farmers and duck hunters need access to assault-style guns, and what sorts of tasks do they use them for?
Janet, there have been thousands of categories of firearms recently banned by order in council, all of which have been legally obtained, legally used by people with possession acquisition certificates, which means they've gone through rigorous safety training, background checks, and constant police checks as well, criminal record checks. So these are firearms that Canada, including this federal government, has always considered to be safe and legal. These generally have not been restricted or prohibited firearms, obviously not prohibited, but they've not been even restricted. Many of these are basically firearms that have been used legally and safely by hundreds of thousands of Canadians. And so you can put all sorts of, Hollywood words on them to characterize them, but these are firearms, again, that have been used and are possessed legally by Albertans and Canadians. And by the way, amongst the thousands of categories that have been prohibited by federal fiat in the last couple of weeks are shotguns that are in wide use by farmers and ranchers as tools in agriculture. So the bottom line is that, and you know what? The federal government has actually come forward with an exemption for the application of these rules to Indigenous Canadians, to members of First Nations, because they recognize that many of these firearms are used in the exercise of treaty-protected hunting and trapping rights. So on the one hand, the federal government is saying that these are firearms that are used legitimately for hunting, and they recognize there's a treaty right enjoined there. On the other hand, they're applying a double standard. Doug, do you want to feel anything in there?
The only other point that I would add to the Premier's comments there is that this is about smart policy versus policy that hasn't been thought through. By investing $500,000, we can take the delay from 8 months down to weeks to make sure we can prosecute cases under the time constraints of Jordan. This is smart policy versus half-baked policy that's going to cost taxpayers hundreds of millions of dollars. Ottawa could have invested $500,000 to speed up the process to make sure that we get our prosecutions done on a timely basis. They didn't do that. Instead, they're targeting law-abiding Albertans. Their priorities are misplaced.
Yeah, and I'll just add one other point. And I'll just add one more point, which is if the goal is to reduce firearms crimes, then they should be redoubling efforts to stop the illegal importation of the kind of firearms that are used by gangs and criminals in Canada. And so again, the target should not be law-abiding farmers and hunters in rural Alberta. The target should be the criminal gangs that are bringing thousands of illegal firearms across the border, primarily in Ontario and Quebec. Did you want to add to that, Michaela?
Sure. Thank you for the question, Ms. French. I think the biggest thing here is that Albertans are feeling frustrated with overreach from Ottawa, and this is just one more example of the federal government really not understanding the needs of everyday Albertans. And those Albertans have relied on the tradition and passing on tradition to family members, including some of these in these what will now be prohibited firearms. At the end of the day, as an MLA, as a member of this government, our obligation is to speak to Albertans and hear their interests, which is exactly what this panel will be doing, this committee will be doing, to provide advice to the minister. And we really need to be protecting private property rights, especially of Albertans who have firearms that have been legally obtained and in many cases passed along for generations.
Operator, can you please put through the next caller?
Next is James Keller with the Globe and Mail. Go ahead, James.
Hi there. This is a question for the Premier. You've said as recently as yesterday on Facebook that you're considering speeding up Phase 2 of the economic relaunch and potentially moving some things from Phase 3 forward into Phase 2. Can you tell us specifically what you're thinking in terms of the timeline, what you would need to see to make that call, and what risks you see in moving ahead more aggressively, only to be put in a situation where you would have to undo some of that if we see a spike in cases?
Well, let me just say that final decisions have not yet been taken. We'll have an announcement early next week about Phase 2. Here's the great news. The numbers have continued to move very much in the right direction. We're down to just over 50 people with COVID in Alberta hospitals, only 5 or 6 in intensive care, and I think only 1 or 2 using ventilators. So we have successfully flattened the curve, which was always the main goal of this of our COVID response. We flattened the curve, and we now have been able to move from 2,800 designated COVID acute care beds to 1,000 designated acute care COVID beds with only 4 or 5% utilization on that. So we are performing. Albertans are doing extraordinarily well in this regard. Yesterday, I believe we had only 13 new confirmed infections reported on about 3,000 tests. Of course, this is not yet over, and we must continue to be vigilant. We'll have to continue to maintain common sense public health measures. And at the end of the day, it's really up to Albertans just to be patient and rigorous about following the hygiene guidelines, the frequent washing of hands and physical distancing, all of that. Follow the advice of the Chief Medical Officer. But it is, I can say that we've been in discussions with the Chief Medical Officer and through her team, and I think there is a high level of confidence that we can move forward with the Phase 2 of relaunch and possibly move forward some of the activities that initially had been planned for Phase 3 into Phase 2. So that's what I can tell you at this point.
Operator, can you please put through the next caller?
Lisa Johnson with Post Media. Go ahead, Lisa.
Hi, thanks for taking my question. I've got a couple of questions. I mean, Minister Schweitzer, you mentioned a $500,000 investment. Is that going directly towards gun testing? And what would be the total cost of the committee or the end date, if there is one in mind? And I'm also wondering, I mean, you mentioned potential handgun bans, MLA Glasgow. I'm wondering, are you saying you would consider moving to stop municipalities looking at handgun bans?
I'll answer the first question regarding the firearms testing. That funding is about $500,000 to expand the scope here. We do about 600 tests a year, but this will give us capacity to do 750 firearms tests a year. And this will be built out in collaboration with Calgary Police and Edmonton Police. The funding for that will come through the Alberta Law Enforcement Response Team funding that we have here in the province of Alberta. And just to speak about the federal government's intention to bring forward enhanced powers for municipalities, earlier this year when I met with the respective federal ministers, I mentioned to them that this is a no-fly zone in Alberta. We clearly have provincial jurisdiction here. They simply cannot bypass us to go to municipalities. This is our provincial jurisdiction. Alberta will always fight to preserve our rights under the Constitution. Michaela, do you have anything else you want to add?
Sure. Just further to Minister Schweitzer's comments, he went over the legal aspect of this, but at the end of the day, the role of the committee is to consult with everyday Albertans and provide common sense solutions as well as a concise plan and recommendations for the minister. So that's what we'll be doing. We'll be consulting with everyday Albertans and we'll be hearing their feedback on that. And if it's any indication of what I've heard so far, it's that Albertans, by and large, are frustrated with this government's overreach, and this is another example of that.
Operator, can you please put through the next caller?
Next is Neil Vaughn with Alberta Outdoorsman Magazine. Go ahead, Neil.
My question is for the Premier. It's, by the way, as the Premier knows, it's Neil Waugh, not Vaughn or whatever that is. But
This is Neil
Premier,
Neil Waugh?
Yes.
My gosh, Neil, it's been ages.
Yeah. But anyway, down to business here. Now, you've just announced, wait for a drum roll, a committee. And also, you've announced some spending for something that the RCMP should be doing by themselves with their provincial budget rather than enhancing it, especially in a time when you're still practicing restraint. In the meantime, my understanding is Alberta legitimate law-abiding gun owners are now receiving threatening letters from the federal government. Now, I haven't gotten mine yet, but I've heard others had. Why aren't you proactively going after the federal government to make them, getting cease and desist orders standing in place until you can get this whole question of jurisdiction and legality resolved by the courts?
Well, Neil, we are taking action. We have announced that we'll be creating an Alberta provincial chief firearms officer. When you were covering Ralph Klein back in the day, that's something he decided not to do. We're saying that personnel is policy, and an Alberta-based chief firearms officer can apply the law in a common sense way that reflects the reality on the ground in this province. That is a very important concrete step forward. The whole development of a firearms office in Alberta will in part be informed by the advice we get from the committee that Michaela Glasgo will be chairing. And the other measure here, look, here's our point. Our point is not just about protecting the legitimate rights of legal law-abiding firearms owners, but also tackling firearms crime. And that's why we're taking a concrete step today. You're right, Neil. RCMP should have brought the firearms lab here to Alberta a long time ago. They shouldn't have these 8-month wait times. But the reality is that they do. And if we weren't to take this action and invest this money now, we would still be waiting 8 months. And one of the ways that we can protect the rights of legal firearms owners is to crack down on the criminal abuse of firearms. And it will be easier to do so, getting faster results from the lab based here in Alberta. So that's concrete action that we're taking. Doug, do you want to add anything to that? He's talking about cease and desist.
Yeah. So right now, we're actually working through with law enforcement here in Alberta, as well as with our prosecution service, to make sure that we have a Made in Alberta policy when it comes to the enforcement of firearms laws that are federal jurisdiction. But we're working through to make sure we have a consistent policy in the province of Alberta that's focused more on compliance to make sure that people understand what the laws are versus cracking down and criminalizing individuals that just a month ago were law-abiding in what they were doing. And simply we're making sure we use common sense in this approach.
And I'll just add something on here. And I'm sorry, Neil, in terms of your question about taking legal action against Ottawa, we are seriously considering that. We believe, based on the advice we've received to date, and we'll get more from the advisory committee, we believe that individual citizens who are impacted by these new regulations would have stronger standing in a court challenge, and we are serious about potentially coming in to support a legal action by an individual citizen or a group of citizens by obtaining intervener status to support such a challenge. And I see that the government of Saskatchewan is also considering that. So we might enter into the support of a legal challenge of a private citizen with other provincial governments.
Operator, can you please put through the next caller?
We have Rob McAnally with CTV. Go ahead, Rob.
Hi, this question is for the Premier, and thanks kindly for taking it. I did want to ask you about the pride flag that was flown on the grounds. There are members of the LGBTQ2+ community who are concerned that it only was up for the one day. Firstly, are there any plans for the government to revisit having the pride flag flown? And can you tell me a little bit about the policy regarding your flag protocols? There's nothing on here that suggests, on your website, that suggests that they only fly for one day. So any insight you can provide on that would be helpful.
Yeah, sure. To be honest with you, I don't know who controls the flag policy. I thought it was the legislature. It's a legislature building in part. So I do know that I believe Minister here participated in a pride flag raising ceremony to recognize June as Pride Month. And then also a Filipino flag was raised the next day to recognize a Filipino Heritage Month. So the flag poles that stand outside the federal building are used for multiple different celebrations and commemorations. So I think they cycle through different flags to recognize different important dates and commemorations. And beyond that, I'd be happy to have our office get back in touch with you to clarify whether that's the legislature responsibility or government, because I'm simply not clear on that myself.
Operator, can you please put through the next caller?
Next is Scott Dipple with CBC. Go ahead, Scott.
Hi, just a couple of quick questions for Minister Schweitzer. Sorry, I just wanted to clarify, you mentioned that the funding would be for 750 tests per year from Alberta, is that correct?
It'll have the capacity to test up to 750 firearms per year through the new firearms lab.
Okay, is that a ballpark figure for the number of tests coming out of Alberta to the federal lab?
On average, Alberta has about 600 cases that go to the federal lab per year. So this would give us more than enough capacity, we believe, to handle any heightened needs in any given year.
Operator.
Okay, and just one other quick point. Could I find out, do you know if other provinces also do not rely on the federal RCMP lab?
Well, perfect example, the City of Calgary and City of Edmonton have their own labs as well. So this is not something that's abnormal. This is a strategic investment, and we're building on what we have here in the province of Alberta.
Okay, we have time for two more. Operator, can you please put through the next caller?
Kelly Kreiderman with Globe and Mail. Go ahead, Kelly.
Hi there. Thank you for taking my question. I'm wondering, now that Bill 1 has passed, the Critical Infrastructure Defense Act, whether you, the Premier, will be reassuring Albertans that their ability to, the right for free expression and association will continue. There has been a lot of concerns about that, and I'm wondering how the bill will be implemented. I'm also wondering, Premier, if you are concerned that people who are worried about the economic impact of the shutdowns associated with COVID are not being represented in Canadian politics today.
Okay, so on the Bill 1, yes, this is the Critical Infrastructure Defense Act, and we've been clear as possible from day one that this in no way impairs legal, legitimate, constitutionally protected protests. Our government respects freedom of speech, freedom of assembly, and the legitimate exercise of those freedoms, including political protests. This bill was targeting unlawful blocking of critical infrastructure in a way that threatens public safety. So holding a political protest to make your point, whether it's support or opposition to a pipeline, for example, is something that we will always respect and defend. But standing on a highway or railway tracks or other critical infrastructure in a way that can create a threat to human life, to public safety, and at the same time illegally impair Canadians' livelihoods, that is not lawful protest. And so all Bill 1 does is to strengthen provincial administrative penalties against those who illegally and dangerously block critical infrastructure. It in no way impairs lawful protest. On your second question, I think that's a very interesting question. That certainly here in Alberta, we saw, I believe, some 25,000 businesses, about 15% of businesses that operate in the province whose operations were significantly affected, in most cases suspended, because of recent public health measures. And that is exactly why we have been moving forward with our relaunch strategy. I think that, and it's also why we have provided over $12 billion in Alberta's fiscal response to the COVID crisis, including, in the case of employers, covering over $300 million in their WCB premiums, cutting non-residential property taxes, deferring those taxes, deferring utility payments, and other measures. We'll also be announcing additional support for small and medium-sized enterprises that were affected by public health orders over the past 10 weeks, and recognizing that those businesses were hugely affected due to no fault of their own. So I just offer this as well, this context in terms of Alberta. I'm proud that Alberta has been able to maintain some of the least stringent public health restrictions in the Western world over the past 2.5 months, while achieving some of the best public health results. Just to give you an example, in Ontario and Quebec, they shut down all of manufacturing and most of construction. In Quebec, they've had, in many parts of Quebec, it was not permitted for anybody to meet. We've had a limit of 15 people at events or gatherings here in Alberta. Our assessment is that we've had the least stringent public health measures amongst the least stringent in the Western world, with the exception of perhaps some Midwestern U.S. states and Sweden, famously. And yet, we have been at the bottom of the curve in terms of per capita infections, hospitalizations, ICU admissions, and deaths. So that is, I believe, a confirmation of the personal and social responsibility demonstrated by Albertans over the past several weeks. We want to, once again, that's one of the reasons we're looking forward at accelerating Phase 2 of Relaunch and bringing some of the Phase 3 aspects forward as well.
Okay, one more question. Operator, can you put through the last caller, please?
The final question is Audrey Neveu with Radio Canada. Go ahead, Audrey.
Hi, Premier. My question is for you in French, as usual. Est-ce que vous pouvez me dire en quoi ces mesures vont aller convaincre le fédéral de ne pas aller trop loin dans leur pouvoir sur les armes à feu? Est-ce que ça va vraiment changer quoi que ce soit face à M. Trudeau?
Oui. Tout d'abord, nous croyons que le gouvernement fédéral a raté le cible parce qu'ils mettent l'accent sur les réglementations qui ne sont pas raisonnables contre les propriétaires des armes à feu légaux, les gens qui, les agriculteurs, les chasseurs, les gens qui, depuis toute leur vie, ont possédé les armes à feu de façon entièrement légale et sûre. Pour nous autres, le cible doit être les criminels qui importent les armes à feu illégaux des États-Unis. 80% des armes à feu qui sont utilisées dans la commission des crimes au Canada viennent des États-Unis de façon illégale. Alors, ça doit être l'accent de l'action. Nous autres, nous appuyons en Alberta le contrôle des armes à feu raisonnable. Mais on va défendre les propriétaires légaux. Nous considérons l'action légale dans les cours pour appuyer les propriétaires contre les réglementations fédérales. Deuxièmement, nous avons créé ce comité avisoire pour donner le gouvernement provincial, la considération des propriétaires des armes à feu en Alberta à cet égard. Troisièmement, on va créer un officier provincial pour mettre en vigueur les réglementations en ce qui concerne les armes à feu. Et enfin, on va ramener ici en Alberta notre propre laboratoire pour aider la prosecution des criminels qui utilisent les armes à feu.
All right, thank you very much.
Thank you.